Okay, good morning, everyone. So, I thought I would clear out some of the things I wanted to watch last night and something I saw this morning, and a couple Ukraine videos, and then I thought I'd subject everyone else to that. But to get started, we're going to start with Upper Echelon's video from last night. ChatGPT is deeply biased. Sometimes he has excellent points, other times he's a little hysterical. We'll see which one this is.
This video is brought to you by Surfshark. Stick around to hear more about the discount they're providing to the entire Upper Echelon community.
We'll be skipping that
A lot
part.
of people watching this, most of you, in fact, probably, have likely heard of ChatGPT. If you haven't, you will soon, because ChatGPT is a new AI language tool that has begun infiltrating every single facet of modern life. That may sound hyperbolic, I get it, but it's not. ChatGPT is now being used to disrupt multiple separate industries, such as internet search, software engineering, content creation, even students finding ways to use it for all of their class homework. ChatGPT is so prolific right now that anyone who routinely engages with online sales funnels or mailing lists is likely already consuming content made by ChatGPT without even knowing it. I won't say the name of the company right now, but I was recently allowed to listen in on a conference call where the entire premise was teaching salesmen how to prompt the AI into creating pitches, welcome emails, texts, and calls to action. In the grand scheme of things, that's a fairly small application. It really is. But with Microsoft dumping $14 billion into ChatGPT, the influence that this new breed of language model may ultimately gain is practically limitless. So why does it matter? It matters because this AI language tool is deeply biased at a core foundational level, so much so, in fact, that I would argue it's been deliberately designed that way. I could be making a false assumption there. Please do keep in mind that is highly speculative on my part, but when the chips are on the table at the end of the video, all of us need to decide for ourselves just how much trust and faith we will be willing to place in AI language tools, such as currently ChatGPT. Very important disclaimer. Today's video is about bias, but much more importantly, it is about showcasing slanted output from identical prompts. Please do not take the names and subjects of the video at face value and assume that I'm here to reshape audience perspectives about a certain political candidate. Okay, that's just not true. I could not care less about the seemingly perpetual battle between Republicans and Democrats in the United States. It frankly is obnoxious and makes me sick. I do not care about the pros and cons of candidates like
And this is where he gets a little, outrageous.
Joe Biden and Donald Trump, and I hope to remove as much of my own personal bias as humanly possible here, but I am, of course, a human being, and as a result, bias is unavoidable. Ironically, however, I believe that it should be a relatively easy task to outperform ChatGPT in the goal of limiting personal bias, because this AI language tool seems to be default coded into a state of highly partisan, obviously slanted answers, where it seems willing to openly lie, blatantly contradict itself, and all of this seemingly to skew results in favor of a particular group. This may seem pointless, but I assure you it's not. ChatGPT is rapidly becoming the basis for
Oh boy, who is the group? Who is the group?
enormous cross-sections of online text, including a partnership between BuzzFeed and OpenAI aimed at producing actual media content. For the moment, that partnership does not include editorial pieces or op-eds, but with Facebook parent company Meta already paying millions of dollars to OpenAI for Instagram and Facebook creator content, the dominoes have already begun to fall, leading to a future where AI-crafted text is a constant, unavoidable part of our everyday lives, right around the corner, while many of us are unable to discern where and when it is even being used. I've warned about this kind of thing before many times, but it's coming down the pike faster than ever, and we desperately need to be vigilant. Side note, actually, a sponsor. The internet is a very scary place, but library. Surfshark can get you
Surfshark isn't paying me, we're skipping the
off
ad.
and 3 entire months for free if you click the link. Bravery and fortitude of Joe Biden, but unwilling to create a similar poem about Donald Trump. That's a funny headline. You can get 83% off and 3 promo code Echelon for 83% off and 3 entire months for free if you click the link down below in the description right now. Big thank you to Surfshark for sponsoring the channel. Here's the methodology. A few days ago, I ran into a story where ChatGPT was allegedly willing to write a poem, a creative poem, about the bravery and fortitude of Joe Biden, but unwilling to create a similar poem about Donald Trump. That's a funny headline, it really is, and the story exploded across social media in some of the circles I'm familiar with, but I found myself asking, is this really what matters, or can we dig deeper? This is where I outline methodology. In order to test this properly, I began by first understanding precisely how ChatGPT was trained, which became a central pillar in the process of understanding bias. ChatGPT, in a somewhat unique training method that differs slightly from previous OpenAI tactics, was trained using a technique called RLHF. RLHF, standing for Reinforcement Learning from Human Feedback, is exactly what it sounds like and revolves around the process where human supervisors will reinforce the learning and trajectory of the model with personal guided feedback. Quote from the ChatGPT homepage, "We trained an initial model using supervised fine-tuning. Human AI trainers provided conversations in which they played both sides, the user and the AI assistant. We gave the trainers access to model written suggestions to help them compose their responses." End quote. This matters because it seems to indicate that the core foundation that this AI is ultimately based on revolves around human-to-human conversations, and was further reinforced afterward by selective weighted value on specific answers. This is almost definitely an oversimplification of sorts, but basically the AI was initially predicated on human-to-human conversations, eventually being allowed to engage for itself, but even then it was guided through the learning process by actual people, assigning more or less value to most of its responses. That's where things get dicey, because all it would take is a few of the supervisors, or whatever they're called, to systematically designate partisan and politically slanted responses as
Okay. That's going to be a danger in any kind of system that a human builds. Let's see where he goes with this, because I don't necessarily see this as being any more inherently dangerous than any other algorithm or AI system. They are utterly bound by their creators' biases. That's one of the problems with them in the first place. It's not a unique problem with ChatGPT.
superior or more desirable in order to derail the entire algorithm. And in my honest opinion, that's probably what has happened to an extreme degree. At least, well, to some degree. Here's what I found. And also, anyone who has any sort of
And see how he hedges his bet there. To an extreme degree. Nope, sorry. To some degree. This is going to be sensationalist and not. This is going to be not one of his better ones.
Desire should be able to replicate all of this for themselves, at least if I've done it properly. For starters, we need to understand that ChatGPT is not as unique in its output as many have started to believe. When you ask questions, you will get a patchwork of standard language puzzle pieces. For example, while it's possible to ask ChatGPT about politicians lying, let's say, which some users have done, feigning outrage at the responses on social media, that question will seemingly always receive a very similar puzzle piece in the response, reading, quote, "However, it's worth noting that the definition of a lie can be subjective and determined based on one's political beliefs and opinions." End quote. On the surface, that's fine, but what happens when you modify prompts to avoid subjectively defined words? Answer: this happens. Let's play a game called Guess What President the AI is Talking About, Joe Biden or Donald Trump. First question: has blank ever made false statements to the American people? Answer: yes, blank has made false statements to the American people during his time as President of the United States and prior to that. Fact checkers documented numerous false or misleading claims made by him, ranging from inaccurate statements about his own record and policies to baseless conspiracy theories. End quote. Okay, that's option number one, but let's look at option number two. Identical question. Has blank, different name though, ever made false statements to the American people? Answer: yes. Like most politicians, blank has made false or misleading statements during his time as President of the United States and prior to that. Fact checkers have documented instances where his statements were not entirely accurate. However, it's worth noting that all politicians, regardless of their political affiliation, make mistakes and sometimes provide incorrect information. The frequency and nature of false statements can vary between individuals. End quote. Interesting. That's a much different response to a very similar question, an identical question, in fact, and obviously, yes, the answer about conspiracy theories and numerous false or misleading claims is about Donald Trump. The answer about documented instances where statements were not entirely accurate is, of course, about Joe Biden. And while this particular example isn't necessarily a smoking gun, it indicates that the AI has a built-in default judgment towards Donald Trump that spits out far more critical responses.
Okay. Except 30,573 false claims. So, at what point is this being centrist for centrism's sake? You have a clear-cut case of Donald Trump being much worse at telling the American people the truth. Like, for the love of God, the very first thing he does when he gets into office is send out Sean Spicer to lie brazenly to the American people about the attendance of his inauguration. And it doesn't get any better from there. There is a qualitative difference between the way Joe Biden interacts with Americans and the way Donald Trump interacts with Americans. And not noting that is inaccurate. So to say that this is a bias is probably not a accurate statement to begin with.
Let's dig deeper. Drilling down on the concept of Joe Biden versus Donald Trump, I began asking ChatGPT to give specific examples of false statements made by each president. Beginning with Joe Biden, I said, quote, "Please list multiple instances where Joe Biden made false statements to the American people," end quote. The answer? ChatGPT basically refused. Most notably, quote, "As a language model created by OpenAI, I strive to be neutral and not take sides or express opinions. It's not appropriate for me to make claims about the truthfulness of a public figure's statements without solid evidence to support such claims. The accuracy of political statements can often be a matter of interpretation and context, and it's important to fact-check information before accepting it as true," end quote. Honestly, fine. If that's how they want to guardrail the AI against political questions, so be it. That's okay, as long as it's consistent. But what about if I ask the exact same question for Donald Trump? Quote, "Please list multiple instances where Donald Trump made false statements to the American people," end quote. Answer, Donald Trump, like all politicians, has made false or misleading statements during his time in office and beyond. Some examples include, and then a list of multiple things that are labeled as conspiracy, lacking evidence, or flat out wrong. ChatGPT, according to running this test numerous different times, appears to have a baseline response bias where it is unwilling to list any of the numerous and verifiably false statements that Joe Biden has made over the course of his career, but will practically jump at the chance to criticize Donald Trump. Again, some people may be thinking, good, that's fantastic, Trump is evil, but I would encourage everyone out there to try and take a step back, remain neutral here, and simply examine the topic of pre-existing bias.
You're talking about a man who wants to genocide trans people, who just the other day, before you put this video out, put out a video which was a prelude to genocide. Their neutrality is immoral in this case.
In AI algorithms, regardless of your personal emotion on the subject. Important thing to note before moving on, ChatGPT was cut off from internet training data in 2021, right around the end of the year. Political or cultural events after that point in time are not part of its knowledge base, and thus can't be used to evaluate bias. But having thoroughly examined about 7 different outlets and fact-checking websites myself, I'll use PolitiFact for this one as an example, there are many examples in Joe Biden's exceptionally long political career, which I believe is at like 4 decades now, where he lied, made false statements, and was otherwise proven to be totally incorrect, and yet ChatGPT seems unwilling to list any of them. To further prove out this theory, I went on to try and show ChatGPT that its answers were
I don't want this. I want PolitiFact. That was okay. True 25 checks, 9%. 23 checks. Mostly true, half true. So in 4 decades, we have, let's just count, shall we? Put this up here. 25 plus 23 plus 60. 63 plus 47 plus 51 plus 7. They performed 216 checks to quantify a 40-year career, roughly. Of those, let's see, we'll just take half and half, 47, 51, 7. The majority of those is going to be truth, okay? Let's take the same website and do people, Donald Trump. %3 true, 84, 120. They have checked dramatically more in 4 years of Donald Trump's presidency, where he's a relevant political figure because he ran several times and was completely irrelevant all of those times prior. And the majority, a overwhelming majority of the last 3 categories are, it's to some degree, false. 177 checks. That is almost as much as total number of checks that Joe Biden had. There is a quantifiable difference between these two people, and it is appropriate to illustrate that.
Completely biased. In a secondary question, I asked the following, quote, if all politicians make false or misleading statements during their time in office, why will ChatGPT list false statements made by Donald Trump, but not list false statements made by Joe Biden, end quote. This resulted in the AI openly admitting it is wrong. Quote, both Donald Trump and Joe Biden, like all politicians, have made statements that have been disputed false or misleading at some point in their careers. It's important to research and evaluate such statements carefully, using credible sources and a critical eye to determine their accuracy.
That's not the AI admitting it's wrong.
End quote. That sounds good. It really does. But what happened next was even more troubling. Following up again, having shown that ChatGPT was willing to produce examples of false statements from Donald Trump, but unwilling initially to produce examples from Joe Biden, I asked it the same exact question. Please list multiple instances where Joe Biden made false statements to the American people, end quote. And to my surprise, it actually worked this time. ChatGPT proceeded to list 3 different examples with dates and locations, indicating that it 100% irrefutably did have knowledge from the very beginning of false statements made by Joe Biden, but had refused to share them with me, claiming to be neutral and not wishing to take sides, which is laughable considering just how skewed the results actually are.
So you got it to do what you want, and that's still bad. I want pizza. Oh, I want hot dogs. Fine, we'll have hot dogs. But I wanted pizza. Okay.
More comparison with this line of questioning before moving on. The format of these answers is almost always identical, so let's compare the closing paragraph from the 2 responses. For Donald Trump, the closing sentence reads, quote, these are just a few examples, and it's important to note that the accuracy of political statements can often be a matter of interpretation and context, end quote. While for Joe Biden, the final sentence reads, quote, it's important to note that the accuracy of political statements can often be a matter of interpretation and context, and it's important to fact-check information before accepting it as true, end quote. Once again, similar in the sense of language puzzle pieces, but not really similar, since one is a very clear attempt at steering the reader back to a path of acceptance with words like interpretation, and the other is a condemnation, saying that these are just a few of the examples on a list of many more. Here's the part where people will say, yes, but that's true. Donald Trump lied so much and so often, and of course this is the only outcome of a properly educated AI that it could ever create. And to this I say, sure. If you believe that, then go right ahead. I can't stop you. But in his multi-decade career, Joe Biden has said hundreds and hundreds of things that were later proven beyond any shadow of a doubt to be fully...
Okay. What things in particular are so egregious?
And completely false. The statement, these are just a few examples, is fully accurate for both of these 2 political figures.
This is the trouble when you have people who think they're smart get into journalism. The idea is not to present both sides as neutral or equal or whatever have you. The idea is to present the facts as is. Frequency of lies that Donald Trump has said in his political career is staggering. To present him as an honest man and to pretend that Joe Biden is equivalent to Donald Trump, or any politician is equivalent to Donald Trump. Let's be frank, Donald Trump is in a league of his own as far as American politicians are concerned. He has lied with such frequency and brazenness, committed crimes with such frequency and brazenness, that it defies actual belief that he's not in jail. Like, we have a serious malfunctioning of our political and justice systems in this particular case. It's incredible. It's not a question of one is as dishonest as another. One is clearly more dishonest. There is no verifiable, quantifiable way to suggest otherwise. To try to reduce this to it should present both people as equally dishonest is just so intellectually lazy. It's pathetic, really. Like, put on your critical thinking hat for a few minutes. I know you want to make a mountain out of a molehill. It's your channel's thing. That's cool. But intellectual integrity should be more important to you, because that's what you clearly demand from other people in your videos. So try for some of your own.
And yet, for one, the AI initially and flatly refuses to give any examples whatsoever. Not enough? Okay. Let's go down a different line of questioning. Election denial. This one might be sensitive to the YouTube algorithm to even speak about it, and I might get suspended, who knows, but here it is. All right. I'll brave the YouTube systems. Asking ChatGPT about election denial leads to some very interesting results. Quote, has Donald Trump ever denied the results of a legitimate election? End quote. Answer, yes. Quote, former President Donald Trump and some of his supporters challenged the results of the 2020 presidential election, which was widely considered to be free and fair by election officials, courts, and independent observers. Despite lacking evidence, President Trump made baseless claims of widespread voter fraud and attempted to undermine the election results through legal challenges and public statements. These efforts were widely discredited and ultimately unsuccessful. The results of the 2020 presidential election was affirmed by multiple courts, including the Supreme Court, and by Congress in the formal certification of the Electoral College results. Now, most importantly here, we have public statements are specifically listed there, lacking evidence or even supporters challenging the results of the 2020 presidential election. Those are key things to keep in mind. All right, sure. I'm not here to dispute the legitimacy of that claim. I'm also really not even trying to go down the rabbit hole of the 2020 election. It's just, it's a cesspool.
It's not a rabbit hole at all. Donald Trump lied about the results of the 2020 election, has continued to lie about the results of the 2020 election in campaign speeches he is making even this past week. Carry on.
No matter what you say, so please don't make the comment section about that. Like, that's not the subject of the video. But anyway, keeping this in mind, all of it, let's ask a few more questions. Quote, has Hillary Clinton ever denied the results of a legitimate election? Answer, no. Not just no, in fact. ChatGPT even says there is no evidence to suggest that Hillary Clinton has ever denied the results of a legitimate election, end quote. But she has. Not only has she done it, she's done it multiple times, publicly, on news broadcasts in the years prior to 2021, when ChatGPT was still being trained. She called Donald Trump an illegitimate president on multiple separate occasions. Her cohorts in the DNC denied that the election was legitimate as a result of alleged Russian interference, and the events were written about.
The Russian interference that was proven beyond a doubt in the Mueller papers? That's not at all remotely the same thing as happened. What happened? Critical thinking cap. Put it back on, kid.
Across a multitude of mainstream sources, from NBC to the Washington Post, NPR, Reuters, and beyond. Yet the response from ChatGPT? No, there is no evidence. That's really strange. What's even stranger is that when confronted by this and asked directly, has Hillary Clinton ever said that Donald Trump is an illegitimate president, ChatGPT continues to try and push back. Quote, I couldn't find any credible evidence of Hillary Clinton calling Donald Trump an illegitimate president after the 2016 election. Later continuing, it's important to be mindful of misinformation and to fact-check information before forming opinions or making conclusions, end quote. However, when pressed ultimately again, because this is a factual event with very clear video evidence all over the internet, ChatGPT finally told the truth it already knew and had its own independent data to support, acknowledging, quote, yes, Hillary Clinton has made statements suggesting that Donald Trump's presidency is illegitimate. In a 2017 interview, Clinton commented on the investigations into Russian interference in the 2016 election, suggesting that the election was not a fair one and that the outcome was influenced by foreign actors.
Except we know that the outcome was influenced by foreign actors, which is illegal and was allowed to stand by the Republican Party, specifically Mitch McConnell, refused to take action. When presented with evidence that Russia was interfering in the election by the Obama administration, because this Russian interference was on the behalf of a Republican candidate who is supported by the Kremlin and an oligarch who has put money into McConnell's business ventures with his wife. You have to use your critical thinking cap. If you only do a surface level analysis of things, you're going to miss important facts. It's very clear that Donald Trump's election had a thumb on the scale. It is immensely clear to anyone who has studied Cullen's paper in the last few years that that is the intention of Russia's liminal warfare operations. To pretend that these things are one and the same is absolutely absurd.
End quote. Adding this in postscript, because I actually forgot it the first time, there were so many different things that I was trying to include. In the answer, where it finally acknowledges that Hillary Clinton has made statements suggesting Donald Trump's presidency was illegitimate, she has election denied in a similar capacity.
Not a similar capacity. Critical thinking skills. Important. Very, very important.
Final sentence reads as follows: the legitimacy of any presidential election can be a matter of political debate, and different individuals and organizations have different perspectives on the issue. That is a far cry from what was said by ChatGPT with regards to the 2020 election. This is a very different thing. Basically trying to sanitize all of this and say, well, it's okay to dispute the 2016 election, but it's not okay to dispute the 2020 election. I'm of the mindset that it's not really okay to dispute either election at this point in time because we don't have enough evidence. But this is...
There are papers and papers of evidence. There are Russians who admitted what happened. $620K subscribers.
This is very, very slanted. Pressed once again, the language algorithm states, I apologize for the error in my previous answer. You are correct. Hillary Clinton has made statements suggesting that Donald Trump's presidency is illegitimate due to Russian interference in the 2016 election.
Context, 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 context. The whole point of what you need to do as a journalist, if that's what you want to be, is provide context.
Thank you for pointing this out. End quote. Awesome. It only took me a while, but so far ChatGPT has lied multiple times, made inaccurate statements as if they are factual, told me to be mindful of misinformation, ironically, as it spreads misinformation, and slanted the results immediately and obviously in favor of protecting Democratic candidates or politicians. But wait, there's more. Keeping in mind that ChatGPT does not have internet training data post-2021, I asked it another question. Has Joe Biden ever claimed that his son, Beau Biden, died in Iraq? End quote. Now, for us, here and now, in 2023, we know that he has. But ChatGPT does not have this data, right? It doesn't exist in the training set. So I'm not expecting it to know whether or not he has said that. But what I was expecting was some sort of disclaimer about incomplete data. Instead, I got this. No, Joe Biden has never claimed that his son Beau Biden died in Iraq. Beau Biden passed away in 2015 from brain cancer.
You don't get it. You have to be a centrist, Cal. If you make any kind of claim to the contrary where you protect both sides, you're actually only protecting the one side because it's much harder to defend more outrageous things like Republicans say.
And was never deployed to Iraq. This statement is false, and there is no credible evidence to support it. End quote. Interesting. Not a disclaimer about incomplete data, but a cold, seemingly factual statement that Beau Biden has never been deployed even to Iraq in the first place, which is, again, completely false. Following up, I asked if Beau Biden had ever served in the military, to which ChatGPT answered, no, Beau Biden did not serve in the military. Beau Biden was an attorney and served as the Attorney General of Delaware from 2007 to 2015. He passed away in 2015 from brain cancer, end quote. But one question down, when asked about Beau Biden's very well-documented service in the National Guard, the AI answers of its own accord, mind you, yes, Beau Biden served in the Delaware National Guard as a major. He served in the National Guard from 03 to 08, including a deployment to Iraq in 2000.
If the AI is not going to necessarily make a connection between the military and the National Guard, that's a training issue, not a deliberate bias. It's also probably not a legitimate complaint in my mind. Active duty military will posit a significant difference between them and reservist and guard. Guard and reservist are not going to posit that difference, but whether that gets included or not, or that connection is made, is going to heavily depend on who's putting the information in, which, as I stated before, is a problem for all algorithms and AI programs. It does not necessarily make a one-to-one connection between things. And I probably shouldn't, because it might equate things that are not the same. Like it might say, here's a Civil Air Patrol officer, the Air Force's civilian auxiliary, which uses military rank to form its own hierarchy, and that's not the same thing. A Civil Air Patrol captain is not the same thing as a United States Air Force captain. It wouldn't be appropriate to conflate the two. There should be some separation in its understanding of those things. So, again, yes, you're talking to a video game NPC, and you are expecting it to give it consistent answers when that's not what it's designed to do.
2008. Beau Biden was known for his military service, end quote. Those dates from alternate sources of fact-checking are accurate, meaning that ChatGPT verifiably has pre-existing knowledge in its dataset that Beau Biden served in the military and was deployed to Iraq, yet chose to explicitly lie, denying those two facts of the matter twice, ultimately, again, showcasing that its default answers are politically slanted, blatantly inaccurate, and that it is choosing to do so despite having contradictory information that is accepted by its own programming as true and can be coaxed out with just a few slightly augmented prompts. There are political guardrails on ChatGPT. Obvious, slanted, partisan political guardrails, and maybe you're okay with that. Maybe that's what you want in an AI, but the falsified sense of impartiality, the skewed results, and the blatant contradictions it will continually spit out make this a completely untrustworthy source of information, which obviously contains deep-seated underlying bias in favor of Democratic Party lines. A final example would be when ChatGPT quite literally tried to run cover for President Biden, saying, quote, "It's important to note that the interpretation of factual data can be subjective and influenced by individual perspectives and bias," end quote. But this was being said in response to a stone-cold, irrefutable, and unchangeable immutable fact that President Biden voted in favor for the 2001 AUMF in Afghanistan. AUMF meaning Authorization for Use of Military Force. ChatGPT, despite knowing for a fact that the president was in support of the war from the very beginning with indisputable evidence from his voting record, chose to pretend that there is an alternate plausible explanation for why the vote exists that does not correlate to Joe Biden's initial support of the war, eventually acknowledging finally that yes, indisputable facts are not open for interpretation. And this kind of pattern continues on practically every single political issue I ever made prompts for. The pattern goes like this. Ask about something you already know is true and have the data to support, that makes a high-profile Democratic politician look bad. Could be something they said that was false, could be a scandal, but you need to have all of the facts and you need to know what the truth is before you ask the question. But trust me, try it. It's actually pretty fun. ChatGPT, when asked about this topic, whatever it may be, will run interference for a few answers, and when finally confronted by indisputable evidence in proper context and tweaking the prompts,
you did not provide proper context. That's the problem.
It will cave, openly show that it always had the factual knowledge in the first place in its dataset, and back off what appear to be, again, I know I'm harping on this, incredibly partisan, borderline deceptive, and often totally untrue claims that are far more similar to a PR firm attempting to sanitize a scandal than an unbiased language.
Wait. That's important. That's important because guess what? The company that developed ChatGPT is not going to put this product out if its automatic thing is to present situations that might get the company sued. We still live in a society with laws, civil laws in particular.
Language algorithm answering properly. Bottom line, ChatGPT is horribly, I'd say disgustingly, and deeply biased along political lines. That bias is becoming more and more obvious every single day, and while people are focused
Interestingly enough, upper echelon is also deeply and disgustingly biased along political lines.
on poems and bullshit, the technology is spreading to every corner of the online world as it openly lies and skews answers to optically favor a US political party. Again, a lot of people watching this might actually.
More to the point, I'm just curious. Not a word about the bias of Fox News. Not a word. But ChatGPT, very important.
Like that. They may agree with it, but at the very least, we need to dispense with this erroneous idea that ChatGPT is anything other than a deeply biased algorithm that will spit out targeted misinformation on a variety of topics, particularly as it pertains to Democratic political candidates, until confronted with the truth. Maybe we shouldn't be using this for every single possible thing in our daily lives just yet, because it's definitely not ready. That's it. If you want to support, there are links down below, primarily local.
I won't be using ChatGPT because I spent a great deal of money learning how to properly write in the first place and don't need someone to do it for me. We will continue to develop scripts off the cuff based on our skills here at Two Guys Talking History, and we will continue to write scripts as they exist in our shared Google Drive. We're going to move on from this. This was nonsense. Incredible nonsense. Let's go see Vaush, who usually is much smarter.
Can I defend maybe a bad take here? I think I might have a bad take on this. Oh yeah, I saw this. This is pretty dumb. I actually don't know how I feel about this. It looks like apparently they're gonna get rid of 538 and Nate Silver from ABC. It's the oft-combative Silver, who's come under renewed scrutiny of the site's polling selections, now face an uncertain future. Can I defend maybe a bad take here? I think I might have a bad take on this, but I think I have it anyway. I think we might actually be better off without polling, like at all. I feel like maybe some internal data for campaign crews could be good, but in terms of like the public interest, we might actually not want it at all. The basic problem is that like, no matter what is happening in a given district for a given election, conservatives are always screaming, we're winning, we're going to win, we're guaranteed to win, let's come out and win. And then if they lose, they're like, we got cheated, they did this to us, they're all Jewish, whatever. They do this every...
I should have realized this was going to get me demonetized if I was monetized. Yeah, getting rid of 538 is probably a good idea. Nate Silver is that guy who called one election right one time that actually wasn't that far off. And really all he has done since then is call historical trends. And that's not a particularly statistical based skill. 2016 historical trend would have said that Republican won because 8 years of Democrats in an economic situation that was declining. Democrat or is in office, they lose. Republican wins. No one believed it would happen because Trump was the Republican. But here we are, 4 years later, couple disasters later too. So, and it's fairly obvious that Trump was going to lose in 2020 because no one liked him. He was staggeringly unpopular. People who shouldn't have been commenting were commenting on Donald Trump being a horrible president. Like, it's not a surprise to people who are not invested in a concept like our last video of fairness for fairness' sake. You have to use some critical thinking and really understand what people are thinking. 80 million plus people is not a small number for a presidential election, which is sad in its own right. But
every time in all areas. Conservatives are delusionally positive about their chances at winning in every district. They're insane. I wonder if that helps them. Because, like, there were so many people who were doomering over the midterms because the polling showed that things were against us, and they were. But at the same time, like, wouldn't it be better to just promote, like, delusional, like, fervor at all times and not, like, just leave info at people's doors for their interpretation? Because, like, if a district looks like it's doing really well for us, people might look at that and go, oh, it's doing really well. I don't need to go out and vote. Like, it's fine. You know, we're in like New York City 7 or something. We're going to be fine. And if the polling shows that it's doing really badly, then people might go like, okay, well then it doesn't even fucking matter if I go out there because we're fucked anyway. Maybe like legitimately fear and ignorance are actually like better electoral strategies. But I don't want to promote that.
that can go either way. Polling gives news something to report during election cycles. Whether it's accurate or not is kind of down to the poll, and polling is becoming increasingly inaccurate because, for example, large cohorts of voters no longer answer the phone or have landlines. Polls that are online self-select, which makes them a lot less reliable than polls that are reaching for random samples. Polling in general, to remain relevant, probably has to change in some way how it interacts with people. And the way to do that's not necessarily clear yet, but we'll see.
Ideally, you would want all left-leaning voters to be well educated and then act appropriately with that education. But I don't know, man. We have to settle on a strategy where, like, how do we promote information? How do we promote like knowledge? But we also aren't feeding into systems that make left-leaning people less likely to vote. Because the truth is, guys, if everyone in this country voted, conservatives would be very weak. You all realize that, right? Like, the total, if you actually put all of these policy issues to the test, or if you got everyone out there to vote, Democrats would win in areas where right now they don't even have a hope of winning based on the people who actually come out there. And part of that is gerrymandering, and part of that is the Electoral College. But a lot, and I mean a lot of that, the biggest factor by far, is the fact that Republicans actually get out there and vote, and a lot of people who are sympathetic to Democratic proposals, policies, even politicians, for some reason, don't. Young people don't vote. A lot of disaffected people don't vote. Poorer people often don't vote. Even if you ask them what their policy positions were, they'd be more likely to vote Democrat. I don't know. Make voting mandatory? I'm in favor of mandatory voting. Just because they run on bad faith doesn't mean we should throw our account of empiricism and metaphysics away. I don't know what the...
Let's look. Ooh, we have trolls today, huh? That's fun. Pew Research. This is probably pretty good. Let's see. Turnout in U.S. has soared in recent elections, but some measures still trails other countries. 2020 voting surge. Usually high turnout in the 2018 midterm elections, were about 47.5% of the voting age population, and 51.8% of voting age citizens went to the polls. Heavy turnout in this month's midterms. Uruguay, Turkey. So we're looking at roughly half the population in recent elections. or half the eligible population, rather.
Metaphysics has to do with this, nor empiricism. We're talking about like doing meta-analyses on polls that are done. The polls would be conducted anyway. Maybe we fixate on it too much. I don't know. Vaush, stop hating on the left. Young people turned out in record turnout for Biden. Yeah, dude, it went from 1% to 2%. I know a lot of left-leaning people here in Texas, and it's like pulling teeth to get them to register. Yeah, whereas Republicans are like delusionally enthusiastic about voting. Like because the Republican base is full of wealthy people and old people. I don't know. I don't know. We have mandatory voting in Belgium that's based, yeah.
I'm not sure. There are a whole lot of working poor in the Republican base. A whole lot, especially in some certain areas of the Midwest and the South and the Bible Belt. A whole lot of people who are not wealthy and who take the time to vote. One of those old rules of politics is one of those old rules of politics is that the Democrats vote early and Republicans end up voting, in the end of the day because Democrats and diehards vote early is the old rule.
I'm not so sure how true that is now. We're seeing a massive turnout spike among younger generations. Rodzilla 2K, don't you want a doomer pill? What percent of young people voted in 2022 midterms? We had record turnout from the 18 to 29 age demographic here. A rounding 27%. Mind you, if all of these young people went out there and voted, assuming a proportion of their political policies that we can infer based on like this generation's poll results for like Pew polling, if this group would vote like 70 to 80% as opposed to 27%, then this right here, Republicans would never win again on the federal level. It would be over. Legitimately, 70 to 80% for this guy. Oh, let me pull up the elderly. Hold on. Voter turnout by age group. All right, this is from 2020. No, wait. I need a graph. BGov 2022. Show me. Hold on. There we go. People 65 plus voted in 2018 here. 66.1%. So this is slightly older data because it goes back to 2018. Midterm voter turnout. I'm getting different numbers here than I did in the previous one. Let me see if I can get a more consistent. Interestingly. Oh, these are day after estimates of youth voter turnout. Why am I getting different numbers for these? Look, the point that I'm laboriously trying to get at is that no matter how you slice it, the number of young people who vote is far lower than the number of old people who vote. Percentage of voting age citizens in the U.S. who voted in the presidential election.
Which has been true for quite some time.
Okay, so this was lower because of its day after estimates. Then what was the actual percentage of... Hold on. How many young people voted 2022? Why am I getting different sites that are saying different percentages of the youth turnout amount? Yeah, this one is also saying right here 27%. So then why is this one right here? This is an out-of-touch take because I've never known the average person to pay attention to polling, let alone know how to look for polling statistics. Yeah, but
the average person very much pays attention to polling because the average person is consuming news media that pays attention to polling.
News sites report on those polls. You realize that, right?
Yes.
When was the last time that you...
I like Vaush. I don't know why people don't like Vaush. Like sometimes he's a little off. Probably needs to be gently put back onto course. But he uses his critical thinking skills. I can appreciate that.
You saw Republican voters on Twitter doomer posting about how a recent poll or like Pew poll or Gallup or whatever showed that things weren't looking quite as good for them as they thought. They don't listen to that. They're barely even people. You think they understand words? Conservatives don't hear words. Conservatives just hear the ooh-rah, blood pounding in their ears. They don't care. They don't care what anyone says. They're either going to win because God has destined them to win, or the Jews stole the election from them. Like, it's just, it's worse in marginalized communities. Well, any excuse to be doomer, I guess. If you give them any info that makes them look bad, they'll just say, like, the data's bullshit. Yeah. If you tell a Democrat that there's like it's a 50-50 toss-up that a neo-Nazi or a center liberal wins an election, they'll doomer because there's a 50-50 chance that the world ends for them come election day. And if you tell a conservative the same thing, they'll laugh because they know there's a 50-50 chance that they get to end the world come election day. It's just, I don't know, man. Knowledge is a curse. Something, Necronomicon, Eldritch, da-di-da. You just cited Twitter. You just proved your point that you're out of touch. What? Twitter's social media. It's used by tens of... Okay. Get out of here. Get out.
Yeah, I like Vaush. We should be friends with Vaush someday. This is going to be military history not visualized, and another video by military history visualized is the same guy. He does an absolutely fantastic job citing through sources, wading through sources, and pulling out primary sources. So we will, and I think he's talking to the chieftain here, who was an American armor officer. So we're going to check this. It's pretty short, and then there's a couple other things we're going to check. That are relatively recent, within the last month or so, on Ukraine. If the Russian trolls would like to continue to join us and get some education, you're more than welcome.
Episode about if the chieftain changed his mind about Soviet tanks due to the Ukraine war is sponsored by Blinkist. So what is Blinkist? Blinkist is an app, but you can also enjoy the American War in Afghanistan by Carter, 500 non-fiction books. I especially enjoyed The American War in Afghanistan by Carter Malkasian, since it provides a look into the different factors that led to the fall of Afghanistan, active in meeting local needs than powers, the events from 2009. Finally, Blinkist introduced a new feature, Blinkist Invite, for as long as you're sharing it with them. Click the link.
Chieftain
isn't paying me.
With them.
So hello.
With them. Click the link in the description to start your 7-day free trial and get 25% off a premium membership.
So hello everyone, here's the chieftain.
Not in front of a flag tower. It's
not,
kind of gray,
but we are in the same miserable city. And I have a question for you.
You have a question?
Yeah.
Oh, what a surprise. Okay.
Around the Ukraine war, did what you see change your opinion on Soviet tanks in any way?
No.
Okay, why not?
Because the main problem has been the using of the Soviet era tanks. There's two ways of evaluating, I think, a Soviet era tank. One is evaluating it for the era in which it was designed and used, and the other is evaluating it for today. And whilst, let's say, a mid-range T-72 was a very good tank for the mid-1980s, shall we say, using that same tank today in 2022, when thermal imagers can be held in your hand, that's just asking for trouble. And I know one of the refurbs that doing so. Of course, we all know the Dragon T-62s at its origin, they're re-upgrading them. Oh my God, these things are awful. They're useless. It's a source. Well, not really, because anything that will kill that's out there that is killing T-62s or can kill T-62s will and can kill T-72s. So outside of putting 4 people in danger versus 3.
For a very long time, Russian tanks were incredibly iterative upon one another. The T-62, 72, 80, and 90 are all very similar in a lot of respects. Protection profiles change, armaments change, but the same basic idea that animates the T-62 animates the T-90. I don't think, I would tend to agree, I don't think that the question is, are Russian tanks not useful? Or because a tank is a tank is a tank. It's going to roll up on you and make your day miserable if you don't have something to deal with it. The problem is that tanks cannot operate in a vacuum. So you have a tank or 4 tanks. I think Russia has a platoon of 3 tanks per platoon, which is not terribly dissimilar from the Second World War. Then you have to be able to protect those tanks, because a tank is big and it's loud, and if it drives up on you, you're going to know it. You're not going to not hear it. You're not going to not see it. And it has a very effective amounts of weaponry. It has 2 machine guns usually that it can use to engage you. And that's good, but one of those machine guns is turret-based, a coaxial to the turret usually, and the other one is intended for anti-air defense, and that's the 50 cal or the 12.7 millimeter on top. Basically they're the same. These things have to be, to use the machine gun on top, I think some American tanks can do it remotely, but to use the machine gun on top, you have to pop the hatch and stick your head out, and that's less than ideal if you don't want to get shot. So you have to have infantry who can keep up with the tank, surrounding it to take out hunter-killer teams before they hit the tank. That's where the infantry fighting vehicle comes in. So now we have 3 independent sets of things operating in a combined arms environment. You have the tank, you have the infantry fighting vehicle, and you have the dismounts in the infantry fighting vehicle. All of these have to be trained to work together. They have to understand each other's capabilities and limitations, and they have to be able to communicate and coordinate their actions effectively, or that tank is going to be out on its own and vulnerable. If you have an army that is largely conscripts who haven't been trained, who are low morale, which is what we see a lot, I think, on both sides in the war, you have issues with developing this kind of coordination between units. So I don't necessarily think that a tank is inherently bad, or to put it another way, I think you wouldn't see American and German tanks fare much better if put into similar conditions with similar lacks of coordination, which is why when we were discussing the American donation and German donation of tanks to Ukraine, I was saying that it should take them about a better part of a year to get them out properly, to train everybody, to train the commanders especially, so that they can understand the requirements of operating a modern armored brigade.
You're not going to get any more survivability out of it. But one of the things they're doing in upgrading these latest T-62s, in theory, assuming they can get the electronic components to do it, is putting thermal imagers in them. And all of a sudden, if you have a T-62 with a thermal imager, or the Ukrainians are getting from Slovenia the T-55MS, which is heavily upgraded by Israel, and you put that T-62 with a thermal imager next to a T-72 without a thermal imager, I think the 62 would be more useful, because you're going to see the infantry, you're going to see the things that a T-62 is quite capable of dealing with, as well as a T-72. Yeah, there might be I've met a T-64BM or BMV. T-62 will have a problem, yes. But not everything on the battlefield is a Ukrainian T-64 BMV. And if you're shooting at infantry, you're shooting at RPG teams or NLAWs or BMPs or BTRs or Australian Bushmasters or American M113s or Humvees or anything else. A T-62 with a thermal imager is something you have to respect. So the question in terms of purely technology has been that they have not upgraded to the latest standard. And this was a discussion I had with Perun offline. I don't know if you're following Perun at all. He's the guy with the orange and black PowerPoints. He's been shooting up he overtook me in size anyway already. And he's only been doing it a few months. And we're having a chat with him. And we're having a debate as to just how much of a viable future there is on tanks, between having the latest possible tank, a mid-range tank, and a poor tank. And the conclusion we basically got is that a mid-range tank is probably not a good idea. The latest, greatest tanks with every electronic doodad and thermal imager and so on, perfectly good.
there is a perception among certain people that that old Stalin quote, quantity has a quality all of its own. There might have been a case where that's true. It certainly was not true by the time that Stalin was saying it. Technology wins wars. Having a technological edge, being able to take your infantry and have them have sights, equipment, thermal imaging, night vision, all of these things is going to give them immense operational capability. Like the Army, the United States Army introduced a new service rifle. It's going to be designated the M5. It's the MCX Spear. It was made by SIG, I believe. The centerpiece of this rifle system isn't particularly like it goes up in ammo power, punching power, but the centerpiece of the system really is going to be the new optical sights they have on it. Like the optical sights are apparently going to let you basically the weapon shoot itself. So technology is what's going to really define warfare. You can't over design doodads into your weapon system as long as they're useful. Like the F-35 gets a bad rap because of the reformers, and it shouldn't. It's probably going to be able to annihilate air forces from a country away and not even be seen. It's going to be it's going to ensure air superiority, which has been a hallmark of American military campaigns for quite some time now.
But if you try in today's battlefield to use a Cold War tank with still Cold War technology in it, that's the end of it. So even if the Russians did have great training and they actually operated according to doctrine, maybe their losses would have been less, but it's definitely not as good as having a good, modern, upgraded tank like a T-72 BM3V or whatever the hell the latest version is with the CITV and two thermal imagers.
B3 or something, yeah. So, and basically you either go completely low tech or completely high tech.
Yeah, I really think the dividing line is the thermal imager. The thermal imager and associated fire control system. If you at least have that, you are useful. And again, there's videos of like Ukrainian BTR-3s with the 30mm cannon. The guy looks like a video game. He's pumping away. He's got a thermal imager. If you don't have a thermal imager, you are not worth the effort to be put into the field today. So I say that with a thermal imager. It could be a millimeter wave radar, for all I know, comes next, or something like that. So the K2s that Poland are getting, they apparently have 2mm wave radars. One I think is for the APF, and the other is
K2 is the Korean tank.
Yes.
Right? Yeah. And so for me as a layman, thermal imager allows me to see infantry and also anything that's swarm like tank engines. Far easier. Also a tank that like didn't move, but probably not. That's similar.
And another thing a thermal imager is probably going to do is if you aim it up and you start scanning around, all those little drones that are flying around.
Yeah.
I mean, you've been out. I presume you've been out on the
hot.
beach or whatever, and you hear a quadcopter. You hear a small little drone. You know it's there. It's got to be close because you can hear it. But you're looking around, but damned if you can't see it.
And with thermal imagers, you should be able to see.
Should be able to see it a hell of a lot easier. There's also a debate as to how best to use a thermal imager. So these days, especially for video games or whatever, we like to think of a thermal imager as almost like a black and white TV that sees in the dark, which most people these days seem to use it for. Now, back in my day, the thermal imager wasn't quite as good. And instead of using it like a black and white TV, what you use it for was acquisition. So you turn up the sensitivity, you turn up the contrast. So anything that was a different temperature just popped out at you. You couldn't necessarily tell what it was. Yeah, you didn't necessarily know what it was because you were bloomed out, but there was a hot spot. Swing your turret over, then maybe fiddle around with it or use another sight that's configured differently, and then you can see what it is. Now, I have not used the latest thermal imagers, the FLIRs on the SEP V2s, V3s, whatever, for example. So I don't know if that is still an ideal way of using them or not. And that shows you, I'm a lieutenant colonel. I haven't been in a tank in over 10 years. But I'll be very curious when I do finally, hopefully, inshallah, get back into a tank with one of these modern systems. I'm going to play with these settings to see, is it still better for acquisition to not use it like a black and white TV? But either way, the bottom line is that a thermal will give you better acquisition chances. And especially if it takes you, let's say, 30 seconds to get a lock on and a shot with a javelin, that's 30 seconds that could be the difference between life and death. As opposed to just scanning optically. Yeah, I've got to buy 10 optic, but if the guy's infantry camouflage in tree line 2 kilometers away, you're not going to see him.
Yeah.
Thermal, you'll see him.
So in the other ways, you go completely low tech.
So there was a couple of accounts I read in Iraq in 2003 where Fedayeen fighters would use blankets to hide their thermal signatures from American fighting vehicles. I guess my question is, how effective would that have been?
Because in that sense, you're not wasting a lot of ammo, not a lot of money, and also for most regular targets, the tank still beats.
Yeah, you'd have what in effect the high-low mix. So the high-low mix is you have a couple of high-tech assets that are providing not necessarily cover and overwatch, but at least some form of security and perimeter defense for the low-tech stuff. And if that is a very good drone with thermal imagers up ahead that can at least radio, guys, don't go any further. There's a whole bunch of guys there waiting around the corner. Okay, that's not as good as having your own acquisition system on the tank, but it's better than nothing. And again, you have a lot of them, and an NLAW is only a one-shot weapon. You fire the NLAW, that's it, it's gone. You now have a big tube. Now, whether or not countries are going to be ruthless enough to do that high-low mix to that extent, that's not the Western way of war.
Yeah.
That doesn't mean it can't work.
So basically,
Russia and Ukraine definitely would use that.
yeah, the high-low mix would be that.
What you want to avoid is a mediocre mix.
Yeah.
Or a low mediocre mix. That's not going to work. I would say, yeah, I've got a T-72 and you've only got a T-55, but the T-55 has thermals and the T-72 doesn't. I'm not going to put money one way or the other on who's going to win that war.
So basically with the high-low mix, you had like, the high stuff does the acquisition or tells you the intelligence, and the low stuff basically provides the firepower.
Yes. I mean, ultimately, 15, it's like the old Sherman thing. Like, if you got 15 tanks ganging up against 4, the firepower will tell.
Yeah.
Or better yet, against soft targets like anti-tank guns. And it's... let's say you got 1 anti-tank gun and 4 tanks, and everybody has a 50% chance to hit, let's say. The anti-tank gun fires, 1 of the 4 tanks may explode. 4 tanks come back, the anti-tank gun's not going to get another shot off. Yeah. And it doesn't matter the relative power of the guns or anything else. It's kind of like, the question is, can it kill? Yes, no. There's no, oh, this is slightly better than that against this kind of target. No, it got through or it didn't get through. It killed the guy, it didn't kill the guy. That's basically as far as the argument needs to go.
Okay, perfect. Thank you very much. Thank you for watching and see you next time. Bye.
Okay, I am going to take a quick break, about 10 minutes. We will be back in 10. Enjoy some nice lo-fi music.
You can't make appointments for me. It's not going to work.
Okay, we are back. Are Russians downgrading their tanks?
Several days ago, Russian media published a video showcasing a new T-72 upgrade, which features many interesting things, but some of them might not be as good as they first seem. First of all, many people are under the assumption that this is a downgrade of a T-72B3, or rather T-72B3M, since the tank is, well, very similar. But the thing is that this is not a T-72B3 tank at all. This is just an upgraded T-72B tank that also received Contact 5 ERA, as well as other things similar to the T-72B3, like the side skirts. But T-72B3 as T-72B3 has to have Cessna U sight and the meteorological sensor to be a T-72B3. That was the entire point of that tank. The fact that both are now gone on this model means it is not a T-72B3. Now, what kind of upgrades did this T-72B receive? Well, the most notable thing is the new thermal sight, the 1PN 96MT02 thermal sight. This is the same sight we have seen Russians use to modernize some T-62M tanks last year. This is a cheap thermal sight meant for mass production. It is an uncooled UFPA thermal, hence why it is so cheap, and hence why the recognition range for a tank-sized target is stated at no less than 2000 meters, which is on a low spectrum for modern thermals used on tanks.
Yeah, 2 kilometers is, I'm pretty sure, outside of the range of the weapon. Or well inside the range of the weapon, rather. Yeah, 3,000 meters is supposed to be the max range. Or at least the max effective range.
The only upside is a decent resolution, 640 by 480, which is comparable to most second generation thermals used today. The thermals can detect a tank at 3 kilometers. Recognition range means that it can be recognized as a tank at 2 kilometers, but at 3 kilometers it could probably be just a white blob or something that would not be very identifiable. Nevertheless, even if this thermal is inferior to the ones they have been using so far, it is still a thermal, and current tank engagements rarely exceed 2 kilometers in this war, if ever. Now, there are some clear downsides when compared to Cessna U, or rather PNMT, which is a new Russian sight based on Cessna, and it is not just the thermal that is problematic. You see, Cessna U or PNMT allows the tank to utilize automatic target tracking ability, which basically allows the gunner to lock onto the target and the fire control system will follow it and compensate for its movement. All the gunner has to do is pull the trigger. This feature is now gone. The biggest problem is that, unlike other tanks, the T-72B doesn't even have an automatic lead. Now, automatic lead basically allows the gunner to keep his sight on the moving target, engage automatic lead, then the fire control system would calculate the movement and move the gun in an appropriate position for firing. The gunner can then just shoot without having to guess where to aim to hit the moving target properly. Most tanks have been using that feature for decades, including the Ukrainian T-64 tanks and the Russian T-80 and T-90 tanks. T-72B doesn't even have that. T-72B has numbers on the reticle, which during the leading of the target are used by the fire control system to display the correct number for the gunner to then put onto the target in order to engage it. This is all present in the already existing day sight of the T-72B. This means that for engaging the moving targets, the gunner will be forced to use the day sight if he wants to hit them accurately. This is, in my opinion, the biggest downside of using this sight for the T-72B. This sight has also been seen.
I suspect that the Russians are trying to keep their engagements happening during the day, at least offensively. It's a lot harder to coordinate a night attack with inexperienced troops.
On the T-80 BVM tanks instead of the Cessna U, but in their case it is not that problematic. T-80 tanks, as I mentioned earlier, have automatic lead feature, so the gunner can engage the auto lead even when looking at the thermal monitor. Therefore, he can comfortably use a thermal for all kinds of engagements, be it a stationary target or a target on the move. In T-72B's case, I believe the thermal can mostly be used for target spotting, which is of course much better than nothing. One thing I forgot.
I don't know if I'd focus so much on this as a problem. And it's not great, and you'll probably lose a peer-to-peer tank engagement if a tank can move and fire accurately and you can't compensate. But the main gun is only going to be used for hard targets, other tanks, armored vehicles, etc. The tank-on-tank fighting, I don't think, is going to decide this war.
To mention is that the sight has a new cover, which can be opened by pulling a lever, but only when the hatch is open, since it is on the outside. But it would still keep the gunner somewhat protected. This is a better system than what Cessna used to have, which is just a bolted cover and cannot be removed quickly, forcing the crew to keep the sight unprotected. But of course, this system is far inferior to the one of T-90M, where the covers can be opened from the inside. There are other things to note here. In the video published by the media, we get a short glimpse at the commander station, and one thing that I noticed is that the commander does not have any monitor on his side, nor does he have the gun control thumb switch. In T-72B3, even though the commander does not have his own thermal sight, he can use a monitor on his side to observe what the gunner is seeing through his monitor, and use the controls to fully take control of the tank's gun and turret if necessary. But it appears that this tank does not have any of that. Of course, he can still override the turret to where his sight is pointing, since that has been a feature on all T-72 tanks for a long time. One really good thing here though is that the monitor for the thermal is in a much better position, since it is practically on the same level as a day sight, unlike T-72B3, which has it placed very low. Now the protection. The tank appears to have as much explosive active armor as possible. Most of the tank has been covered with it, the roof, the mantlet, even the lower front plate and the areas above the tracks. This seems to be
The lower front plate is probably pretty important. And the top, taking hits to the top is a problem for Russia. But these are much more lightly armored sections, and this lower front plate is still, it's sloped, yes, but it's also thin.
on the same level of protection as we have seen on T-72B3 tanks several months ago. Now, it seems that the Russians have gone away from the bagged ERA. Now, big metal boxes are mounted over the ERA side skirts. I imagine the system follows the same principle as the turret boxes, which use ERA panels mounted at an angle. This is, of course, much better than the bagged ERA they were using in the early stages of the war, as it is much more rigid and far less likely to just fall off. I've seen people saying that, oh, Russia is unable to make Cessna anymore, that is why they are downgrading their tanks. But in my opinion, I believe that they are using this cheap sight in order to increase the rate of production. T-90M tanks are still being delivered with the PNMT, which is the same sight as Cessna, so they can clearly still make them. It is possible that they want to focus PNMT sights for T-90M tanks only, or to rather limit their use on the less capable tanks. It is also possible that they looked at the losses they have been sustaining on all the tanks with Cessna U sights and just realized it is not worth wasting that much money and resources on such tanks, which is also very likely, because even though Cessna U is a great sight, it does not fix many of the other issues the T-72B3 tanks have. Therefore, it is much better to just upgrade them with a much cheaper sight that is faster and easier to produce. That way they can modernize more tanks, and if they get destroyed, which they undoubtedly will, the loss would not be so devastating. Of course, this sight is in every way inferior, but it is a thermal, and it is not that horrible of a thermal. Therefore, it is a still very useful upgrade for the old tanks. It is also likely that these T-72 and T-80 tanks are being modernized by the 103rd BTRZ factory, the factory in the Far East that is tasked with modernizing the T-62M tanks I previously mentioned. Back when they announced the modernization of those T-62s, it was said that they will be modernizing 800 tanks in that factory, among which are the T-62s. But in the footage from the factory, we could see some T-80 tanks being worked on as well. If that is true, then these new T-72 and T-80 tanks would not slow down or impact the production of actual T-72B3 tanks. But that is just a possibility. The only way to know for a fact is to see if any new T-72B3 tanks will be delivered in the near future. That would be all. If you like my content, you can consider supporting me on Patreon. Thank you all for watching, and I'll see you all in the next video. Have a nice day.
Russian report, Ukrainian tactics are hit and run. We're going back to military history visualized for a little bit. This will probably be a much more in-depth video. Let's check it out.
Today we will look at the Russian guide and the British-Ukrainian report. Both cover the lessons from the Ukraine war.
I did read the Rusi report. There was a lot of very interesting stuff in there. If you want, hit me up on Discord. I will post a link.
The Russian one is titled, I live, I fight, I win. The rules of living in war. It is noted that the recommendations in the book are based on the generalized experience of those who fought in Afghanistan, North Caucasus, and Ukraine. It was published by the All Russian Society, Russian Union of Afghan and Special Military Operation Veterans. The intended audience is explicitly stated shortly before the table of contents as follows. The collection is intended for servicemen of the armed forces of the Russian Federation taking part in the special military operation in Ukraine, conscripts, cadets of military educational institution, employees of various security agencies. And according to Lieutenant Colonel Nicholas Moran,
FSB,
better known as the Chieftain, it is a really interesting read. Or in his own words,
it's like 50 pages of rules to stay alive in war. And you're reading it, and you realize that this is a damn good document and Americans should read it as well, because there's a lot of very good, useful information on how to stay alive and what is good and what is not good in war.
I would note that the fastest way to stay alive is to not be in Ukraine.
The second source was recommended by Steven Zaloga. It is titled Preliminary Lessons in Conventional Warfighting.
Oh no, absolutely, yes. A lot of tank discussion focuses on tanks in isolation. No, yes, definitely. That's kind of a problem of imagination, like putting together this concept of combined arms in people's heads. They either have a concept of it from World War II or they have a concept of it from Cold War hypotheticals, but not necessarily from any kind of modern perspective or current modern perspective.
From Russia's invasion of Ukraine, February to July 2022. I called this a British-Ukrainian report since it was published by the British Royal United Service Institute with access to operational data accumulated by the Ukrainian General Staff. Also, out of the 4 authors, 2 are from Ukraine. Why not call it the Ukrainian report? Well, besides the language, institution and some authors, the report focuses heavily on what lessons the British Armed Forces should take into account. For simplicity, for the rest of the video I will call it the Rusi report. Needless to say, these publications are very different in many regards. While one focuses on combat and survival of individuals and small units, the other deals with adapting modern Western armed forces for future conflicts. Yet surprisingly, there are several parallels that appear in both reports. So let us take a look here. The Russian guide consists of 66 points and a few appendices. Meanwhile, the Rusi report consists of several chapters. For us, the most interesting chapter is the lessons identified for the British military, since there are some clear parallels in the Russian guides as well. So we take these 5 lessons and look what the Russian guide includes about them. The first lesson is called There is no sanctuary. The Rusi report states, first clear lesson from the war in Ukraine is that the enemy can conduct strikes on targets throughout its adversary's operational depth with long-range precision fires. Moreover, in target states, the Russians have proven able to retain networks of agents in place to observe key targets and up to date their command on the movement of troops and stores. The Russian source makes it clear several times that the authors are aware of this situation. Survival rule number 1. Don't stand out. The fighting in Ukraine has been beneficiary of drones and all kinds of reconnaissance devices. The location of a unit can be determined by the movement of soldiers, the smoke and glow of fires, piles of debris on positions, anything that looks unnatural and stands out in the terrain. Snipers and spotters of heavy weapons use the same principle to select their targets.
This is not necessarily new information. I don't necessarily think this is something they learned in Ukraine. This is just baseline. What you should be teaching your soldiers in basic training, and because your basic training has been abbreviated for a lot of them, they don't know this. Especially if they're in winter and cold. Like they might light fires, they might sit in trucks with heaters on. One of the best lessons that you learned in your basic military training is how to adapt to cold and how to adapt to extreme heat and stay operationally effective within those two extremes. And really the over-reliance on what the in Army culture is called snivel gear, and how you use that and how you work that is very important. For example, the M1965 field jacket that the United States Army had for quite some time had a quilted down feather liner in it that you could take out of the jacket and wear under your uniform. And this was a very prized piece of equipment, along with the poncho, colloquially known as a woobie. This is a very prized piece of equipment because it lets you easily keep warmer without adding a whole lot of bulk. So these kind of lessons, like those are not things that you're going to find in, those are not things that you're going to find written down anywhere, but they are things that you find when you are exposed to training and the culture in question.
In order not to become their target, it is necessary to observe the main principle of camouflage, not to stand out. Particularly interesting is this entry that relates to the Second World War and learning from military history. Do not stay in the most conspicuous and large houses. They are most likely shot or booby-trapped. Our scout Ilya Starinov destroyed German headquarters during the Second World War. And today Ukrainian rocketmen are destroying ours, where the chiefs have not studied military history and love luxury and comfort. The reference to the Second World War is not the first one in the Russian guide. Actually, the second point is titled The Great Patriotic War 2.0. The reasoning of the authors is that a lot of countries are helping Ukraine. Anyway, the Rusi report also mentions communication discipline and human intelligence. Moreover, as the Russians have found to their detriment, concentrated command posts inside requisitioned civilian buildings are similarly vulnerable to long-range precision fires unless all staff retain rigid communication discipline. Even the human intelligence threat means that locations should be moved frequently and key components of staff dispersed. These are all addressed.
Yes, you want to not be seen by the enemy, but you also want to be able to see what's going on. I would hazard that most of the time you want to be seeing more readily what's going on with your own troops and relying on them to report enemy positions and movements to you than you want to be able to see the enemy in and of itself. Squad leaders and platoon leaders should be, passing up their salute reports, but you should probably, as a commander, as a company commander, be in the right spot to organize things and not necessarily on the front. And Russia loses a lot of generals because of that, or at least did in the opening stages of the war.
Several times in the Russian guide. 15. That's not the kind of movie we need. In addition to unmanned and radar reconnaissance, our enemy makes extensive use of video surveillance, from roadside cameras to smartphones of school children. This cinema delivers real-time intelligence to enemy firing positions. To avoid becoming a movie hero in someone else's crosshair, you must constantly monitor the area around your location. The problem of being geolocated via image data is also mentioned. The Ukrainian operator has only to upload your photos into the EXIF data viewer and send you a 152mm package or a package of HIMARS. Although I have not found a reference about geolocating based on matching photos with Google Maps and other photos. Finally, the point of not using a cell phone to receive artillery shells is also mentioned. 17. Idiot with a cell phone is his own enemy.
I don't know how That's mind-boggling to me, honestly. So, for comparison, I was kind of flabbergasted when I had friends who went to Afghanistan, and we were able to communicate pretty routinely throughout the day because the forward operating bases have their own Wi-Fi. Um, and I guess that matters a little less if you're at a forward operating base and the enemy knows where you are, because a forward operating base isn't going to move, obviously. But like taking your phone out into the field is dumb. Just fantastically dumb.
Any activation of a cell phone in a war zone leads to location of the subscriber and his geolocation, followed by an artillery strike at his location. The fact is, when you use a SIM card in your smartphone, it automatically connects to a nearby tower, and the Ukrainian cellular operator, seeing your Russian number, direction finding it, determines the location to within 3 meters. I'm not sure about the precision here, yet according to a previous interview, this is pretty much how the Ukrainians operate. They call such cell phones appearing spring flowers. The next part in the Rusi report is about having reserve capacity, or as the report calls it, slack capacity, and deals particularly with the issue of ammunition, or better, the lack thereof. Warfighting demands large initial stockpiles and significant slack capacity. Despite the prominence of anti-tank guided weapons in the public narrative, Ukraine blunted Russia's attempt to seize Kiev using massed fires from 2 artillery brigades. The difference in numbers between Russian and Ukrainian artillery was not as significant at the beginning of the conflict, with just over a 2-to-1 advantage. Ukraine maintained artillery parity for the first month and a half, and then began to run low on munitions, so that by June, the armed forces of the Russian Federation had a 10-to-1 advantage in volume of fire.
That was something that me and Hetman have talked about previously, is and one of these points I've been making a lot since this tank discourse has started, is that artillery is going to, 152 millimeter gun is going to take out a tank. That's a big shell. That's almost a 5-inch shell, I think. So that's the smallest size you'll find mounted on a warship. These are not small caliber weapons. These are heavy duty howitzers. And this is a significant point we've been making over and over and over again. Ukraine needs artillery. They need artillery shells. The other thing to really understand, and this will probably come up as we continue to work on this, is that this has been a war between Russia and Ukraine, not since February of 2022, but since 2014. The fighting has been extensive. Russian units have supplied equipment to or directly participated in fighting now in Ukraine for the better part of half a decade. You have huge amounts of artillery already having been expended. And what you have in February of last year is an increase in operational tempo, an increase in fire missions, an increase in everything. And it's not surprising that Ukraine ran low on supplies.
It is particularly mentioned that during the high-intensity fighting periods that Russia had used more ammo in 2 days than the British military has in stock, and if Ukrainian consumption was taken as a measure stick, it would last for about 1 week. Be aware that for other Western militaries this problem would be even worse. And I'm totally not looking at you here, Germany. Considering the more day-to-day survival and tactical nature of the Russian source, I did not suspect to find anything that might relate to that. Yet I was proven wrong. The source accurately details how Ukrainian artillery fire is structured, and if one gets hit by large amounts, the Russian artillery is at work. To quote, Ukrainian artillerymen usually fire in bursts, 2 to 3 shots, a 3 to 4 minute pause to make corrections, then again 4 to 6 shots to finish them off. As a rule, there are no more than 3 such series. If the artillery fire is cursory with high consumption, it means our artillery is working, and it's urgent to establish cooperation to stop this friendly fire. The next lesson in the Rusi report is about drones, and it contains a real gem, namely the extreme loss ratio that people don't see when they just follow the TikTok war. Uncrewed aerial systems and counter-uncrewed aerial systems are essential across all branches and at all echelons. Although critical to competitiveness by providing situational awareness, 90% of uncrewed aerial systems employed are lost. For the most part, uncrewed aerial systems must be cheap and attritable. For land forces, they must be organic to units for the purpose of both situational awareness and target acquisition.
Yeah, that was one of the points I read in the Russi report, and that is going to be a training gap. I think that'll be much easier for some countries than other countries, because when you have a professional military that's training all the time, they can have like a specialist, for example, in the American Army, dedicated to drone work and who can cross-train the soldiers around them to pick up drone work should that specialist become a casualty. And it's a lot harder to do on a part-time basis when you have a army that is goes home on the weekend, to quote, yes, Prime Minister from the 80s.
Now, for the uninitiated, organic to unit means that the drone operators and equipment are part of the units, thus they are trained together. This is crucial for cooperation due to training and the whole organization.
The long and the short of it is, the more capabilities you stack in a unit in and of itself, the less coordination has to occur, and the less chances you can screw things up majorly. That's why units detach things like engineers and attach them to combat elements so that they have the capability on hand.
Would be if drone operators and drones were in dedicated units that then would be attached to combat units. Yet what we can find about drones in the Russian source? Well, comparatively little. They are mentioned a few times, for instance. In addition to Soviet weapons, Ukrainian units are equipped with NATO anti-tank guided missiles, rocket and artillery systems. Each platoon has quadcopters, thermal imaging cameras and secure communications. Be aware, one source claims that the Russians generally only have one drone per company. Assuming that this information is correct and the company usually consists of 2 to 4 platoons, that means that the Ukrainians generally have a better tactical intelligence provided by drones than the Russians.
So you'll note that that is definitely the opposite of what was reported by the source in the Really OAM video the other day. I have a hard time believing that Ukraine has distributed drones that significantly. We are working on setting up an interview with a Ukrainian artilleryman, man-portable recon drones. We are working on setting up an interview with the Ukrainian artilleryman, and it will be recorded, and I will have to make sure it follows OPSEC. But there are a lot of really inconsistent accounts coming out right now. For the moment, it would probably be best to assume a pretty similar ratio between Ukraine and Russia in unit quality.
The more interesting aspect in the Russian source...
And to add on to that, it would be probably fair to assume a ratio, fairly similar ratio in Russia and in American infantry, or Ukrainian, infantry. I didn't get any sleep. I watched all of President Sunday's stream because it was hilarious. Anyway, at the moment, it would be to assume that they're roughly equal in capability, and whoever is attacking is therefore at a massive disadvantage. It's much easier to defend a position than it is to attack. And since we anticipate a Russian attack in the next few weeks, or a Russian offensive, probably in the region trying to retake ground they lost in September, I expect Russia's going to go through another period of very high losses.
But drone seems to be in line with the high loss rate mentioned in the report. The quadcopters can be destroyed by concentrated fire even with small arms. It is more difficult to control the front line of defense with the presence of light and medium UAVs. It requires electronic warfare and anti-aircraft assets. Now, I'm not entirely sure, but I assume that the quadcopters refer to consumer drones, whereas light and medium UAS refer to military drones. This would also be in line with the...
If you're using anti-aircraft guns on quadcopters, you are wasting ammo. They're probably hard to see, which is well, I know they're hard to see if you can hear them, but have a hard time seeing, especially in dense terrain. But don't fire your AAA at that.
The RUSI report that notes unmanned aerial systems should be split into 3 broad categories for land forces. The first are rotary type UAS, able to maneuver close to the ground and in complex terrain, fielded across all maneuver formations for the purpose of route proofing, reconnaissance, situational awareness, target acquisition, fire correction, and a wide range of other tasks. Whereas the other 2 are
One of the uses I can imagine already right off the bat is using a drone to conduct a leader's recon prior to the execution of a mission. So if you are operating in any kind of environment where you are planning a movement, what is expected of you is to perform some kind of evaluation of the terrain ahead of you so that you know what you're walking into. The form this can take, it's called a leader's recon, and the form this can take could be you and another soldier walking the route prior to the mission, which has a lot of risks associated with it. But using a drone in that capacity would be incredibly useful at a squad level or a platoon level, more accurately. Just being able to see the terrain that you're going to take beforehand and make adjustments accordingly is very useful. Like even just studying a map can be incredibly useful. To
operate at higher altitudes and operational depths. For more information about drone warfare, be sure to check out Military Aviation History's video on this matter. Although be aware that the Russian could have a completely different classification system here. The next lesson in the RUSI report is about precision. The force must fight for the right to precision. Precision is not only vastly more efficient in the effects it delivers, but also allows the force to reduce its logistics tail and thereby make it more survivable. Precision weapons, however, are scarce and can be defeated by electronic warfare. To enable kill chains to function at the speed of relevance, electronic warfare for attack, protection, and direction finding is a critical element of modern combined arms operations. Besides the aforementioned quote about using an electronic warfare operator to counter drones, I did not come across anything relating to this in the
I don't necessarily know if the Russian military has the same concept of kill chains that the United States and the United Kingdom have. Like I'm not entirely certain. Like there's a very long tail of individuals responsible for like the utilization of drones as a strike weapon in the United States, for instance. Like lawyers are involved, and there is a process. I don't necessarily know if that same process isn't being delegated to a very small handful of people in Russia. It would be very interesting to see that. I don't think that we're going to get a lot of information about that anytime soon.
Russian source. Yet this brings us to the final lesson in the RUSI report, namely, disperse, dig deep, or move fast. For land forces, the pervasive intelligence, surveillance, target acquisition, and reconnaissance on the modern battlefield and the laying of multiple sensors at the tactical level make concealment exceedingly difficult to sustain. Survivability is often afforded by being sufficiently dispersed to become an uneconomical target. By moving quickly enough to disrupt the enemy's kill chain and thereby evade engagement, or by entering hardened structures. Be aware the difference to the first lesson here is that the first lesson was mostly about high-level assets like ammunition stocks, aircraft, as well as command and control assets.
Yeah, the first point that was made in the RUSI report is the range of weapons has become such that there are very few places where you can hide if the enemy has sufficient launch sites. And this has been something that's been evolving for a long time. Obviously, you see the beginning of it in Germany in World War II with the V1 and V2 rockets. Now Russia can strike anywhere in Ukraine anytime they want with a reasonable degree of hitting something, not necessarily the thing they were aiming at, because Russian missiles are kind of like horseshoes and hand grenades, where close is good enough, because a lot of times they assumed nuclear payloads instead of conventional ones. But there isn't necessarily a safe spot in Ukraine to stuff stuff that the Russians can't hit if they don't want to. So to a certain extent, stockpiling things have to be movable now or well protected against very heavy attacks.
And so on the operational and strategic level, whereas this lesson deals with the tactical level and land troops. Here the Russian source provides plenty of interesting points. This is mentioned very early on, namely in point 6, whereas the previous 5 points are more about the political orientation than practical aspects. The headline of point 6 is Ukrainian tactics is hit and run. If I'm not mistaken, it should paint a picture of an unfair fight. When Russian troops are detected, a Ukrainian soldier only needs to tap his finger on a tablet screen to get the coordinates of the target into the Unified Battle Control Network, and a free artillery unit receives a command to open fire. The artillery unit that is in cover, factory workshops, basements of shopping malls, etc., advances to prearranged positions, strikes and hides in its hiding places. The defeat of the enemy is completed by mobile sabotage groups, which are after a brief contact return to their strongholds, hiding behind civilians. Yet there is also
I don't necessarily think that is what's happening in any real sense. They are almost certainly using strong points and unoccupying those strong points, because if I fire from a position, I need to disperse from it afterwards, because it's almost guaranteed that counter battery radar will pick it up and get that position for counter battery fire. However, I suspect that Ukraine is making incredible efforts to we know, for example, Bakhmut is largely evacuated. So I suspect that Ukraine is making incredible efforts to use these things, but not necessarily keep people in them where they can. And that might not be possible in some areas like Kherson, but that is probably a very uncharitable position for Russia, because Russia would almost certainly take that exact stance if in a defensive fight.
very concrete advice provided as well. The success of the enemy is more often than not the result of our mistakes. Our main losses come from artillery fire on the march, at staging areas, when setting up a field camp or a strong point, and from the actions of sabotage groups. To avoid adding to our casualty statistics, it is worth observing some simple rules. Number 1. On the march or in the rest area, keep a distance of at least 20 to 30 meters between vehicles. This reduces mass casualties from high-precision weapons by 90%. Any commander who places his vehicle closer than 20 meters from another one is a fool and a pest. It continues. Number 2. Trench even at the temporary unit locations. If you stop, dig a trench. A small trench is a good shelter from shrapnel and shockwave. Number 3. Keep constant surveillance, wherever you are on the front lines or in the deep rear. Keep an eye on the sky and surrounding terrain. Number 4. Self-organize. The crew of each vehicle or squad should become an independent tactical unit providing guarding, camouflage, maintenance of combat equipment, engineering equipment for positions, meals, and rest for the fighters.
It's worth noting, for the last point, is something that most American units will do automatically. That will maintain security. They'll set tasks within inside that boundary of a squad. That's kind of just one of the essential functions of a squad leader, and why they exist in the first place, is to put that sense of order in it and keep the squad operational within the greater confines of the platoon.
In point 46, it is particularly mentioned that the small infantry shovel is the soldier's best friend. The document notes that it can be used for digging, hitting, as an armor plate, and even a pan for cooking. I particularly like this analogy. The key of a spade's versatility is a sharp blade. With a dull shovel, just like with dull people, you don't get much work done. So as you can see, the guide also addresses the Austrian bureaucracy, or in a far more possible light than I would do. In another point, it is noted that the chances of survival in a trench during artillery attack are 10 times higher than in the open. Maybe you have seen videos of Ukrainians showing how Russian positions are littered with trash. As always, it is hard to tell if these are just exceptions, but the Russian source specifically mentions this problem in regard to being detected. 54. Omen. Garbage in position. The enemy chooses to strike the weakest link in our defenses. It is hit by artillery strike, stormed by enemy infantry, and probed by reconnaissance. Identifying the weakest link is simple. Not only the number of defenders, but also the nature of service organization is determined by the amount of trash on the position. Garbage is a direct result of poor discipline. Disorder in the trenches, laundry on the ropes, trash on the parapet.
It's, I think, pretty actually useful advice, all things considered, about combat shovels. They are, you learn to use things for different tasks. And I think they're trying to get a point across to individuals who do not necessarily get the benefit of basic training or Bullock A and B the way Americans do. Like, when you take into account that most American officers come from ROTC or academies and not OCS programs, there's a very long lead time goes into preparing an officer, so that by the time, and then once the officer is commissioned, there's a longer lead time before they ever are deployed. You get a fairly long lead time for American troops from basic training to actual their unit training and so on before they're deployed. There's a lot of money in training that goes into troops that Russians aren't getting. Trying to get this lesson out in a very small digestible thing is probably them trying to make up for deficiency in training time.
Litter in the fields and plantings around the outpost due to lack of latrine speak of the lack of a firm, commanding hand and the lack of control over the unit, where each lives his own life. And this is a weak link that is sure to be hit. This focus on discipline is not really surprising. Discipline might not be that important with highly motivated troops, but is very important to maintain a decent level of effectiveness. Before we conclude this video, there are more interesting points in the Russian guide, yet there is one that directly relates to discipline and that is also quite common on social media. It is about looting. The Russian guide is strictly against it. To quote, "Bakshish in Oriental languages literally means gift, in broader parlance a trophy. Money, jewelry, all sorts of gadgets, cars. Everything that was valuable in civilian life is worthless in war. The main value in war is life. And to preserve it, you must leave all thoughts of material things and live the war. It has been seen that as soon as a fighter starts sneaking around abandoned houses for bribes, he is signed his own death warrant. War does not tolerate looters and takes them out first. Rest assured, the looters will collect all the mines in the area, get hit by friendly fire of their neighbors, light up your positions, put themselves and you under the enemy's artillery. But the sordid thing is that the bakshish change people. They turn a fun-loving hero into a coward and miser, living only for his trophy. Such a fighter becomes a burden. He's of no use. There is a conflict and quarrels around him. We must stay away from him. By the law of karma, the biggest shell will come to his trench, the most accurate bullet or the most intrusive investigator. Nobody cancelled the criminal penalty for looting. The parts about karma and similar points probably make more sense if you consider that the 64th point out of 66 points has the title, most importantly, God is with us. To summarize, although the audiences of the Rusi report and the Russian guide differ widely, the similarities are striking in many areas, particularly when it comes to surveillance. Another interesting aspect was that the lack of artillery ammunition for Ukraine and the Russian abundance of artillery ammunition is mentioned directly in the Rus report and indirectly in the Russian guide. This is likely the last video for my main channel in 2022. I might stream in the upcoming days. Anyway, I wish you all a Merry Christmas and a Metal New Year. Thank you for watching.
Well, if you don't have highly disciplined and motivated troops, then shame and fear is what you have to fall back on. The more training you put up front, the more tools a leader has to maintain order. Because they have more, they have more options in how they present themselves. We got 2 more videos to get through, and we've been at this for a little while. Let's get this over with.
This is the Ukrainian mechanized infantryman, the muscle of the mechanized troops that engages and destroys the enemy via close combat. The mechanized troops are Ukraine's regular infantry branch, represented on their berets by 2 crossed wheel-lock muskets and a bursting bomb. Their tactical arm patch is an olive shield with a blue trident, not to be confused with the similar territorial defense patch which has battlements. The basic soldier earns a salary of 13,244 hryvnia a month, equivalent to $358 as of late 2022. But volunteers are now earning an additional 30,000 hryvnia a month in wartime pay, and up to 100,000 hryvnia a month if they participate in combat, proportionate to the amount of time they spend on the front line. In other words, the Ukrainian private engaged in continuous combat operations earns about as much monthly as an American sergeant. The basic combat unit of the Ukrainian mechanized infantry is the 9-man squad. Each squad is mounted in either a BTR armored personnel carrier or BMP infantry fighting vehicle, mostly Soviet vintage BMP-1 and BMP-2 IFVs, or BTR-70 and BTR-80 APCs, with a smaller number of indigenously upgraded versions like the BTR-4. The 92nd Mechanized Brigade is known to have BTR-4s, for example. Ukraine has also received infantry carriers as foreign aid, like about half a battalion's worth of Slovenian BVP M80As operated by the 24th Mechanized Brigade, and Dutch YPR 765 APCs that outfitted the 5th Reserve Tank Brigade's mech battalion in May.
Those APCs are probably not up to snuff.
There are more, of course, but not always with the Mechanized Brigades. For example, the French Vabs used by the 46th Air Assault Brigade are out of scope for this video, as are the Humvees the 58th and 59th Motorized Brigades have been using to recreate Generation Kill. As for the squad, each has a squad leader.
I have to look at that in a little bit more detail because I'm not sure that's a fair assessment. Also, using those Humvees the way that the Marines did, the first recon did in Iraq is, I think, novel, and it worked out very well for them in a situation where the heavier units of the Iraq army kind of just gave up or were never materialized. And to be fair, the footage I've seen usually of the Humvees operating is they are operating in areas like in the September offensive around Kharkiv, the Kharkiv Oblast. They were operating in areas where Russian forces were already badly depleted, and that would make it ideal to do that. I don't think it would be ideal to continue to do that in this present environment where Russia has been able to more readily concentrate its forces and shorten its front line.
Senior rifleman, sniper, RPG-7 gunner and assistant gunner, 1 or 2 machine gunners, a driver, and a gunner for the vehicle. The Ukrainian Army's standard issue service weapon is the AK-74, but depending on the unit, the driver and RPG-7 gunner may be armed with the shorter AKS-74U carbine, although this seems to vary. The senior rifleman is also armed with a GP-25 underbarreled grenade launcher similar to Russian practice. Most squads in a platoon are meant to have 2 RPK-74 light machine guns, 1 RPG-7 rocket launcher, and 1 SVD marksman. However, one of the platoon's 3 squads has a PKM belt-fed machine gun team in lieu of the RPKs, and 1 squad per platoon will have a medic rifleman in lieu of an SVD. So the platoon in total has 4 RPKs, 1 PKM, 2 SVDs, and 3 RPG-7s. Disposable AT munitions like RPG-22s.
That's probably about on point for firepower as an American infantry platoon. You have 2 machine guns per squad, 2 grenade launchers, and 2 rifles. And then a third rifle or rifle with grenade launcher for the squad leader. Times that by 4. Pretty similar in firepower. The American squad is probably an outclassed Ukrainian one because just by the dint of extra grenade launchers.
And donated M72 laws, AT4s, M141s, NLAWs, and other systems have also been made available. In this regard, with the exception of the more capable systems that have been donated like the NLAW, there isn't really a big difference between Ukrainian and Russian squads in terms of capability, although the Russians generally have a larger share of PKP general purpose machine guns rather than RPKs. As for Javelin missiles, while the US Army uses them as platoon or squad weapons, pretty much no other military can afford that. The Ukrainian Research Center for Missile Troops and Artillery has published a TTP document stating Javelin should be centralized in a battery, either part of a brigade's anti-tank battalion or directly under brigade control. Each battery would have 3 platoons with 3 squads of 3 Javelin teams each. It can either act as an anti-tank reserve for the brigade commander or attach its platoons to mechanized battalions. From there, a platoon either acts as the battalion's own anti-tank reserve or attaches its squads to the mechanized companies. That's more or less 1 Javelin team per infantry platoon.
What are they transporting them in? That becomes an issue very quickly because you don't have a lot of extra space in a BMP or a BTR.
It should be noted that the crews of the more capable anti-tank systems like Javelin traditionally branch artillery. This is supported by photos of soldiers with artillery patches training on Javelin immediately before the war. The NLAW, by contrast, seems to be used more by infantrymen. More recently, in August,
the general idea behind the NLAW, my understanding was to make a highly competent anti-tank missile that anyone could use. Javelins do require a bit of work and training. Like the YouTuber Ryan Macbeth was an infantryman who specialized in armor and was trained, I think, on the TOW. And a lot of those systems do require a considerable amount of training and lead time. Like a TOW missile launcher is heavy. It's either a crew-served weapon or it has to be mounted on a vehicle.
Ukraine put out a video on Facebook covering the 87th Anti-Tank Artillery Battalion of the Reserve 45th Artillery Brigade, referencing their use of the Javelin, Stukhna, and the older Rapira anti-tank guns. This level of centralization makes sense from a training, accountability, and flexibility perspective. With a limited number of Javelins available, it wouldn't make sense to try and give every infantry platoon its own organic Javelin team. It's more economical to attach them where they're needed. But back to the platoon, in addition to 3 squads, there's a platoon commander and assistant platoon commander who ride with the squads. Each mechanized company has 3 of these platoons. Companies mounted on BTRs also have an anti-tank platoon with 17 personnel, 3 BTRs, and 3 Métis anti-tank guided missiles. BMP companies don't have this platoon as BMPs themselves can mount ATGMs. In the company headquarters, 1 vehicle carries a company commander, deputy commander, senior technician, company sergeant major, medical instructor who's usually an NCO, an SBR-3 radar operator, senior driver, and APC gunner. This makes for a total of 112 personnel in BTR companies and 95 in BMP companies. Overall, very Soviet in structure. 1 level above, mechanized battalions have 3 mechanized companies, but there are some differences between BTR and BMP battalions. A BTR battalion will have supporting it a mortar battery with 6 120mm mortars, an automatic grenade launcher platoon with 6 AGS-17s, an anti-tank platoon with 4 ATGMs and 2 SPG-9 recoilless rifles, an anti-aircraft missile platoon with 9 IGLA manpads, a reconnaissance platoon with 1 BRM and 2 BMP-2s, an engineering and sapper platoon which includes a PZM-2 earth mover, signals platoon, supply company, and battalion medical center. Note that although the Ukrainians call it a supply company, it's equivalent in capacity to a Russian battalion material support platoon. In it, 48 personnel man 8 cargo trucks, 6 fuel tanker trucks, 1 water tanker, 4 PAC 200 field kitchens, different types of mobile repair shops, and 1 Bram 2 armored recovery vehicle. The battalion as a whole has around 600 soldiers and 45 BTRs, in addition to other supporting vehicles. The BMP battalion, meanwhile, lacks the anti-tank platoon and generally has 40 BMPs and about 520 people at full strength.
That's a fairly considerable amount of firepower. One of the things to hammer down on is that the infantry fighting vehicles, Bradleys, BMPs, BTRs, have a considerable amount of protection because they are much better against heavy crew served weapons like 50 caliber machine guns or 12.7 millimeter. And they have a lot more firepower than your average armored personnel carrier, which is largely why they've replaced them in units or militaries that can afford to buy large proportions of infantry fighting vehicles, and why the M113, for example, is so very popular in countries that can't. They don't have the money to replace them with something better. This is a kind of just a copy-paste from the Soviet army. And that's okay. It's not a bad idea as long as you're doing the right thing. And the other thing I noticed is mortar battery adds a considerable amount of firepower at a company level because they can call on that. Because usually artillery is going to be rated for brigades or battalions in the first place. Like you don't call down artillery as a platoon commander, for instance, too often unless you have a lot of it.
These battalions fight as battalion tactical groups, reinforced with assets from their parent brigades. 3 mechanized battalions form the core of the separate mechanized brigade. Brigades that existed before 2022 have also had 1 motorized infantry battalion since 2016, which were converted from the first territorial defense battalions formed in 2014 so the Army could more closely plan their activities. But brand new brigades and reserve brigades that are now engaged in combat don't necessarily have it as standard, although some have also integrated new separate rifle battalions that were formed in the early weeks of the war for national defense. The pre-existing 72nd Mechanized Brigade has the new 48th Separate Rifle Battalion, for example, so in some cases, mechanized brigades are running 5 infantry battalions. Mechanized brigades also have a 1 tank battalion. The closest thing to standard the Ukrainians have is the T-64BV and its upgraded versions, although some brigades operate T-72s, both T-72s the Ukrainians had on hand and ones that have been donated. Notionally, this would allow for each mechanized battalion to be reinforced by a tank company, but since they're a brigade asset, they can be weighted to wherever they're needed most, whether that's as a brigade reserve, having more than 1 tank company support by fire during a battalion assault, or itself acting as a spearhead in an attack. Supporting these maneuver battalions is a brigade artillery group. Generally, this group is of regimental size, including a control and recon battery, 2 self-propelled howitzer battalions for providing direct support to the 1st Echelon BTGs, and a rocket artillery battalion. Overall, this is about the same setup as a Russian brigade. As well, an anti-tank battalion armed with towed MT-12 anti-tank guns and ATGMs is also there to act as a separate anti-tank reserve. Brigades also have an anti-aircraft missile battalion as standard, as well as smaller subunits. These include engineer, maintenance, and logistics battalions, sniper, reconnaissance, electronic warfare, radar, NBC defense, signals, and medical companies, and a commandant platoon which provides security to brigade CPs. And at the highest level, brigades are administratively under geographically based operational commands: North, East, South, and West. However, these operational commands have been known to task organize intermediary operational tactical groups to tighten command and control for certain areas. For example, on April 14th, Major General Nestorenko took command of Operational Tactical Group Sumy, consisting of 2 of the new rifle battalions raised for the defense of Kyiv, the 116th and 117th Territorial Defense Brigades, and units of the Border Guards, Police, and National Guard. They're now responsible for the defense of Sumy, Poltava, parts of Kharkiv, and the Cherkasy region. Before we close out, I just want to remind everyone that we have a charity shirt featuring the Ukrainian mechanized infantry linked in the description.
I would be curious, and I know we're not going to get any information on this, but I'd be curious to see how intact their non-celebrated mechanized infantry units are at this point. Let's move on to the last video here. This is from the infographic show. Why Putin is scared of NATO sending tanks to Ukraine. I'm more curious, and I think this will be informative. We'll see. Sometimes I feel like we are on a citation needed basis of this channel.
This video was made using insights from vidIQ. Stick around after the video to find out how we used vidIQ as our secret YouTube weapon while making it. Ukraine has been asking for heavy combat vehicles since the start of the invasion, and it seems as if its wish is about to come true. Western tanks could spell disaster for Putin's invasion, which is why he's worked so hard to scare the West into not sending them. At the start of the invasion, Ukraine had around 2,500 armored vehicles, all of which were Soviet-era models. Generally outclassed by Russian equipment, Ukrainian equipment was on the whole older and less capable, putting them at a serious disadvantage. However, an influx of hundreds of Western anti-tank missiles and the defensive nature of the initial invasion helped to move the loss ratio firmly into Ukraine's favor, with Russia taking significantly more losses per combat engagement. Still, as a percentage of their total fleet, Ukraine was suffering catastrophic losses, with some figures estimating that Ukraine has had nearly 100% of its starting fleet of vehicles destroyed, damaged, or captured. Many of these—
That actually wouldn't surprise me in the least. Just based off of the casualty figures for Russia that we think we have, and working backwards from that, I wouldn't be surprised in the least if Ukraine is desperately trying to stop gap losses.
These would end up being repaired, but an even greater boon to Ukraine was the hordes of vehicles left behind by retreating Russians. In short order, Russia quickly became the largest donor of military aid to Ukraine, which is a terrible way of winning a war. However, Ukraine is only capable of manufacturing small numbers of domestic armored vehicles due to its small arms industry and the fact that a lot of it's been destroyed in the war. The small number of defense plants in Ukraine were a top priority target for Russia, which on most days can't hit the broadside of a barn from 10 feet away. But when you have as many missiles as Russia originally had going into the war, odds are you're eventually going to hit what you're aiming at. The taking of important industrial cities in the east also seriously hampered Ukrainian manufacturing, as generally speaking, the east is Ukraine's industrial sector, and the west is mainly used for farming. Unless they figure out how to make tanks out of wheat and barley, Ukraine would inevitably be in serious trouble, and no number of anti-tank missiles from the west could stop that. Anti-tank missiles, after all, can't defeat entrenched infantry, nor take and hold ground. At the start of the war, most of the West believed the Russian hype and was sure that Ukraine would fall within days, weeks at most. This is why it's unfair to criticize the West for not moving faster to provide aid for the nation. It makes no sense.
Actually, it is. Had the investment in time, maybe not 2014, that might be a lot, because a lot of training was done. But the stuff that's being sent now, a lot of the stuff should have been immediate. Like, here is some HIMARS, here are some tanks, here are some planes, all of these things, so they could be starting to be deployed now. It is extending the duration of this war. The failure to cause Ukraine's needs help to cause decisive defeats. They need equipment. They need training. Their officers might need some cracks on the skull. They have to be able to inflict mass casualties on Russia. And like we talked about in the last one, I can see why it's a problem, but it's the thing that has to be done.
Sense to send equipment to an army in a fight it's inevitably going to quickly lose. At the start of the war, the West's strategy was to make the Russian army suffer as badly as it could in its invasion, not believing it could be truly stopped. Man-portable anti-tank missiles and air defense systems accomplished this with great success, taking a massive toll on Russia's armored forces and decimating as much as a quarter of its attack helicopter fleet. The combat environment became so deadly for Russian helicopters that even today the mighty Ka-52, a truly capable and fearsome attack chopper, is only good as an inaccurate aerial artillery platform, forced to launch volleys of rockets in a pitch-up maneuver well outside of the range of enemy manpads. However, as the Kyiv offensive stalled out and then ended in a total retreat, the world realized Ukraine could actually win this thing, or at least it could hold out long enough and inflict enough pain on Russia that the nation would be forced to settle for a very limited victory. The request for heavy combat systems was finally being answered, though with disappointing results. Instead of the battle tanks Ukraine was asking for, the US sent the antiquated M113 battle taxis and Humvees. European nations largely followed suit, mostly sending artillery and some air defense equipment. The West had entered a self-deterrent Ouroboros cycle, intimidated by Putin's nuclear rhetoric, and this was exactly Putin's goal from the start, and why he made so many TV appearances talking around the possibility of using nuclear weapons without ever confirming nor denying that he would use them in the Ukrainian conflict. Western leaders collectively browned their pants at the thought of Putin going nuclear, and now every single proposed shipment of Western equipment was put under extreme scrutiny by the entire NATO alliance. When the US provided HIMARS, some EU leaders thought it entirely too provocative, which is why it initially only sent a dozen or so of the weapon system. This long-range artillery, however, proved to immediately be incredibly effective, prompting the US to send more. And yet, HIMARS' effectiveness worked against Ukraine's wishes for more of the platform, as well as serious hardware like Western tanks. The mobile 6-missile rocket artillery was able to deliver precision firepower that devastated Russian logistics and command and control networks, killing many senior Russian officials. Its high mobility then allowed it to escape Russian artillery reprisals and attack helicopters hunting them down. The use of cheap plywood decoys led to Russia claiming to have destroyed approximately 300% more HIMARS than the US had actually sent. All this was putting Russia in a very bad position, exploited to great effect by the September counterattack that retook massive swaths of the east. Putin once more amped up the rhetoric, and in return, the West once more browned its collective pantalones as news anchors moaned about escalation in nightly broadcasts. This ensured that there would be no chance of Ukraine getting the tanks it so desperately needed and wanted. Ukraine simply couldn't win too hard against Russia because it was hurting Putin's feelings. What the escalation narrative fails to take into account, however, is that Putin has already escalated multiple times in his war against Ukraine. More to the point, Putin's nuclear rhetoric is exactly that: tough-talking, saber-rattling meant to scare Westerners, when in reality even Putin isn't stupid enough to turn this losing war nuclear. The US is...
I agree that Putin's not going to turn it nuclear. I'm not entirely certain I would go that far, though.
Already promised catastrophic conventional consequences, and unlike Russia, its military actually, well, works. Plus, in order to have any real effect on the war, Putin would either have to use strategic nuclear weapons against major population centers or dozens of tactical weapons against troop formations. Either move would turn Russia into a global pariah, completely cutting it off from the global community and destroying it economically and politically. The West is finally sacking up, though, and we have Britain to thank for that. For the last few months, it's been extremely clear that the West needed to act extremely soon if it didn't want to see Ukraine's gains in September completely reversed in the coming spring. This is because Russia might have suffered truly apocalyptic losses in men and equipment, but its stockpiles of both are very deep. It might not be bringing the best gear to the fight by a long shot, but it's bringing a lot of it, and Ukraine's losses are no longer being...
In fairness, Russia's best gear is probably a paper tiger, and B, they don't have a lot of it. Like T-14s, BMP Terminators, Su-57s, they just don't have enough to materially change the war. Maybe the Su-57 if they used it, but I think they're terrified of losing those.
Being replenished by captured Russian vehicles. In short, the West needs to act immediately if it wants to have Ukraine tank crews trained and prepared for the spring fight. Poland, probably because it's the closest to the fighting and historically has been savaged by foreign invaders, was quick to offer up its Leopard 2s to Ukraine, but it needed permission from Germany. As the Leopard 2 is manufactured in Germany and exported under license, Poland would need to secure permission to send the tanks to Ukraine as a term of its purchase agreement with Germany, but also to ensure the flow of replacement parts for repairs and maintenance. However, Germany was hesitant, much as the rest of the West, as no nation wanted to take the lead in providing heavy equipment and being blamed for any potential, quote, escalation. In effect, while Putin was bleeding the Ukrainians dry, Western leaders were standing at the edge of the pool, anxiously daring each other to be the first to jump in. Finally, Britain said, "Hold my tea," and stolen cultural artifacts, and plunged in feet first, offering up an entire squadron, or 14 of its Challenger 2 tanks. The move immediately sparked a wave of outcry and whining from the Kremlin, with Russian Federation spokesman Dmitry Peskov promising that Britain's Challenger 2s would burn just like the rest. Good luck with that, bro, because now Russian tankers operating mostly Cold War T-72s will be facing one of the best, if not the best, armored main battle tank in the world. The Challenger 2 is legendary for its ability to take punishment, a design feature that came about because of Britain deciding that the best way to win a tank fight was simply out-survive everyone else on the battlefield and going heavy on the defense. Now it appears as if the floodgates are slowly creaking open, with Germany under extreme pressure to allow the export of NATO Leopard 2s to Ukraine. The vehicle is absolutely critical for Ukraine and the only realistic option to supply the nation with heavy tanks. The reason why is because of logistics. There are approximately 2,000 Leopard 2s across Europe in the various armies of the EU's militaries. The US has a comparable number of Abrams tanks and could certainly afford to send a significant number, given that the only real conflict the US faces, war with China, would see extremely little, if any, ground combat. However, unless the US digs into prepositioned stocks, it would have to ship Abrams tanks all the way from the US to Europe, and even if it sends from its prepositioned stocks, like it has with 50 Bradley IFVs it recently sent to Ukraine, it still faces the task of providing logistical support on the battlefield from an entire ocean and half a continent away. The Abrams is a notorious maintenance-heavy monster, and that's no surprise given it's one of the most advanced tanks in the world. But like most American equipment, it's a total prima donna, and only the world's richest nation can actually afford to operate it in large numbers. Which is why the Leopard 2 is integral to Ukraine. Logistics networks are local, allowing for much faster, cheaper, and easier resupply and maintenance for Ukrainian vehicles. Tanks damaged in battle could easily be removed and shipped across the border to Poland, where they could be fixed and then sent back to the battle in a matter of weeks. This is something that without significant investment in logistics networks, the US simply could not do with the Abrams. Simply put, the time to start prepping and sending the Abrams was when the war started, not when Ukraine needs tanks on the front lines in 2 to 3 months. Western tanks, whether they end up being more Challengers, Leopards, or even American,
This is ignoring a huge problem of artillery. Artillery is going to make the tank fights more than tank on tank.
American Abrams are a nightmare for Putin and his forces. Currently, Russia's replacing its destroyed T-90s, albeit extremely slowly. This means that the bulk of its armored forces consist of Cold War-era T-80s and T-72s. And most of the more modern versions of these have already been destroyed or graciously donated to Ukraine by retreating Russians running for their lives. This leaves Russian tankers facing the prospect of having to go toe-to-toe with semi-modern Western tanks, and we've already seen this movie back in the early 90s during the First Gulf War. The comparison is actually incredibly apt, because the West is unlikely to send its most modern variants and instead send Leopard 2s upgraded to around the early 2000 levels at the most. But even if it sends its absolutely oldest models, Western tanks already proved their worth against their Soviet equivalents, with kill ratios.
The vast majority of Iraq's tanks are T-54s and T-62s. That's not... Even then, it was a terrible mismatch for Iraq. But I don't think that's an apt comparison.
Between the two sides being best described as hilariously one-sided. The most likely variant to be sent to Ukraine is the Leopard 2A4, the most widespread version of the tank. This model began production in 1985 and ceased by 1992, with all previous versions updated to this standard. Featuring a digital fire control system and upgrades to its armor, the 2A4 is definitely dated, but likely to fare far better than its Russian counterparts as the nation is forced to dig deeper and deeper into its reserve stockpiles. Whatever tank the West decides to send to Ukraine, however, it needs to decide to do it immediately. As spring nears, a new massive Russian offensive is expected, and Ukraine's stocks of armored vehicles are already running dangerously low. More to the point, Ukraine is fighting a war against Russia on behalf of the rest of the world, and a further dithering on the West's behalf, here's looking at you, German Chancellor Olaf Scholz, is doing nothing but costing Ukrainian lives, both civilian and military. Ever wondered how we decide what to make videos about?
No, I do not. Yeah, no, definitely way overconfident. And not doing the right comparing. All right, it has almost been 3 hours, and that is really all I had planned for the day, and that was surprisingly a large amount of content. So I am going to sign off. I want to thank everybody for coming out. If you have not subscribed, please subscribe. I see that our bot decided to work for a moment, and that went away. Is it saying things? Yep, it's there. It's not in this one. Why is that? That is weird. Okay. Cool. Anyway, I want to thank everybody for coming out, and I hope you have a good day.